When Margaret raised her hand to strike the children, Grace stepped between them without thinking. "Touch them, and you'll regret it," she said quietly. The wealthy woman laughed cruelly. "You're just a maid. Who's going to stop me?" What happened next changed everything. The morning sun filtered through the crystal windows of the Ashford estate, casting golden patterns across marble floors that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Grace Bennett pushed her cleaning cart through the east wing, her movements practiced and efficient after years of domestic work. At 32, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Eyes down, voice soft, presence minimal. It was how people like her survived in houses like this. The estate belonged to Marcus Ashford, tech billionaire and one of the wealthiest men in the country. Grace had worked there for years, but she'd only seen him a handful of times. Always distant, always surrounded by assistants and security. He traveled constantly, leaving his 2 young children in the care of staff, and recently his fiancée, Margaret Sinclair. The name alone made Grace's stomach tighten. Marcus's fiancée had moved into the estate weeks earlier, and everything had changed. The household staff walked on eggshells now, careful not to attract her attention. Margaret was beautiful, polished, and absolutely terrifying in her cruelty. "Grace!" The sharp voice cut through the peaceful morning like a knife. Grace's shoulders tensed automatically. She turned to see Margaret descending the grand staircase, her designer heels clicking against the marble with aggressive precision. Everything about the woman screamed wealth and power, from her perfectly styled hair to her jewelry that could feed a family for months. "Yes, Miss Sinclair." Grace kept her voice respectful, neutral. "The children's playroom is a disaster. I told you to clean it yesterday." Margaret's eyes were cold, calculating. "Are you incompetent or just lazy?" Grace felt heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her expression calm. "I cleaned it yesterday evening, Miss Sinclair." "Perhaps the children played there this morning. Are you talking back to me?" Margaret descended the last steps, moving closer with predatory intent. "You're a maid, Grace. Your job is to clean, not to make excuses. Do you understand the difference, or is that too complicated for someone of your background?" The words were designed to humiliate, to establish dominance. Grace had heard worse in her years of domestic work, but something about Margaret's particular brand of cruelty felt more dangerous. There was pleasure in her eyes when she degraded others. "I understand, Miss Sinclair. I'll clean the playroom immediately." "You'll do more than that." Margaret smiled, but it held no warmth. "You'll redo the entire 3rd floor by noon. Every room, every surface. And if I find a single speck of dust, you're fired. Am I making myself clear?" The 3rd floor had 12 rooms. Cleaning it properly would take an entire day, even working at maximum speed. Margaret knew this. She was setting Grace up to fail. "Yes, Miss Sinclair." As Margaret walked away, Grace heard her laughing quietly to herself. It was the laugh of someone who enjoyed causing pain, who found entertainment in exercising power over those who couldn't fight back. Grace pushed her cart toward the stairs, her jaw tight with suppressed anger. She'd dealt with difficult employers before, but Margaret was different. There was something genuinely wrong with her, something that went beyond typical wealthy arrogance into territory that felt actually dangerous. The sound of children's laughter drew Grace's attention as she passed the playroom. She paused, glancing through the partially open door. Emma and Daniel Ashford, the billionaire's children, were playing with building blocks on the floor. Emma was around 7, Daniel perhaps 5. They were sweet kids, remarkably unspoiled considering their circumstances. "Grace!" Emma spotted her and jumped up, running to the door. "Will you play with us, please?" Grace's heart squeezed. The children were lonely, she'd noticed. Their father was always traveling, and Margaret treated them like inconvenient furniture. The household staff did their best, but everyone was too frightened of Margaret to show the children much warmth. "I would love to, sweetheart, but Miss Sinclair gave me a lot of work to do today." "She's always mean to you," Daniel said quietly, walking up to join his sister. His small face was serious, too serious for a child his age. "She's mean to everyone, even us." Grace crouched down to their eye level, concerned. "What do you mean, honey? Is she unkind to you?" Emma and Daniel exchanged glances, that silent communication that siblings develop. Emma spoke first. "She tells us we're stupid, that we're disappointments, that Daddy would love us more if we were better." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She'd suspected Margaret was cold toward the children, but active emotional abuse? That was a different level entirely. She locked Daniel in his room for hours yesterday, Emma whispered, tears forming in her eyes. Because he spilled juice on her magazine. He was crying and she just left him there. Grace felt something shift inside her. There were lines you didn't cross, and hurting children was the brightest, boldest line of all. Her own difficult childhood had taught her that much. She'd promised herself long ago that if she ever had the power to protect a child, she would, no matter what. Listen to me, Grace said gently, taking their small hands in hers. What she's doing isn't okay. It's not your fault, and you're not disappointing anyone. You're wonderful, brave, smart children, do you understand? But she says, Daniel started. She's wrong, Grace interrupted firmly. Sometimes adults say wrong things. Sometimes they hurt people because they're hurting inside. But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean you should believe them. Will you tell our dad? Emma asked hopefully. When he comes home? Grace hesitated. Marcus Ashford was unreachable, protected by layers of assistance and security. A mere housemaid accusing his fiancée of child abuse. She'd be fired and escorted off the property before she finished the first sentence. But she couldn't tell these children that. I'll figure something out, she promised, hoping she wasn't lying. In the meantime, if Miss Sinclair is ever really scary, you come find me. Okay? They nodded, looking slightly comforted. Grace hugged them both quickly before standing up. She had work to do, an impossible amount of work designed to humiliate and exhaust her. But as she pushed her cart toward the third floor, her mind was racing. Something had to be done about Margaret Sinclair. The question was what and how, without losing her job and leaving these children completely unprotected. The third floor was as overwhelming as Grace had expected. She worked at a punishing pace, her hands moving automatically through tasks she'd performed thousands of times. Dust, vacuum, polish, organize, over and over. Her back ached, her knees protested, but she pushed through. Around mid-morning, she noticed movement in the garden below through one of the windows. A man was working among the rose bushes, the new gardener, she assumed. The estate went through gardeners regularly. Margaret found reasons to fire most staff within weeks. Grace didn't pay much attention. She had her own survival to worry about. By 11:30, she was exhausted but nearly finished. Maybe, just maybe, she could complete the impossible task Margaret had assigned. It would prove nothing. Margaret would just invent a new humiliation tomorrow. But at least Grace would keep her job another day. She was cleaning the last room when she heard shouting from downstairs. Children's voices, high and frightened. Emma and Daniel. Grace dropped her cleaning cloth and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding. As she reached the main staircase, she saw the scene unfolding in the grand foyer below. Margaret had both children by their arms, gripping them tightly enough to hurt. Emma was crying. Daniel was trying not to. A broken vase lay on the marble floor, expensive flowers and water spreading across the pristine surface. You little brats! Margaret's voice was venomous, her face twisted with rage that seemed disproportionate to the accident. Do you have any idea how much that vase cost? Your father is going to hear about this. It was an accident, Emma sobbed. We were just playing and— Shut up! Margaret shook the girl roughly. I am so tired of your excuses, your noise, your existence. You're nothing but burdens. Expensive, annoying burdens. Grace watched Margaret raise her hand, saw the intention in every line of the woman's body. She was going to strike Emma, going to hit a 7-year-old child for accidentally breaking a vase. Time seemed to slow. Grace saw the fear in the children's eyes, the cruel anticipation in Margaret's face, the empty foyer where no other staff had appeared to intervene. Everyone was too afraid of Margaret to interfere, but Grace had made herself a promise years ago. Protect the children. Always protect the children. She didn't think, she just moved. Grace raced down the stairs and across the foyer, putting herself physically between Margaret and the children. She grabbed both Emma and Daniel, pulling them behind her body. Touch them, Grace said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. And you'll regret it. Margaret stared at her in shock, then burst into incredulous laughter. Excuse me? Did a maid just threaten me? I didn't threaten you. I made a promise. Grace kept her voice calm, but her eyes were steel. "You're not going to hurt these children. Who's going to stop me? You?" Margaret's laughter grew crueler. "You're nobody. You're a servant. You have no power here, no voice that matters. I could fire you with a phone call. I could make sure you never work in this city again." "Maybe," Grace acknowledged, "but you still won't touch these children." The two women stared at each other across the broken vase, the crying children, the marble floor that had witnessed decades of the Ashford family's life. It was a moment of pure confrontation, wealth and power against determination and moral courage. Neither of them noticed the man standing in the garden doorway, still in his work clothes, watching the entire scene unfold with an expression that revealed everything and nothing. The gardener had stopped being invisible, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that followed Grace's defiance was absolute. Even the children seemed to hold their breath, sensing they were witnessing something that would change everything. Margaret's face had gone from shock to fury to something far more dangerous: cold, calculating rage. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Margaret said softly, her voice like ice. She pulled out her phone with deliberate slowness. "I'm calling Mr. Ashford's head of security. You'll be escorted off this property within the hour, and I'll make certain every household in this city knows you're a troublemaker who assaults her employers." "I didn't assault anyone," Grace replied calmly, though her heart was pounding. "I protected children from violence. There's a difference." "Your word against mine." Margaret's smile was predatory. "And who do you think people will believe? A billionaire's fiancée or a maid with no references, no family, and a history of moving from job to job?" The words hit their target. Grace did move frequently, always one step ahead of memories and circumstances she preferred to leave behind. Margaret had clearly done her research, looking for weaknesses to exploit. "Miss Margaret," a quiet voice spoke from the garden doorway. "I saw everything." Both women turned to look at the gardener who had entered the foyer. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of years of outdoor work. His uniform was covered in soil, and there was something about the way he held himself, a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his occupation. "Excuse me?" Margaret's tone dripped contempt. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, gardener." "You didn't ask," he agreed, "but I'm offering it anyway. The maid didn't assault anyone. She protected children from being struck. I saw you raise your hand to the little girl." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And you are?" "Thomas," he said simply. "I started working here last week." "And before you threaten to fire me too, you should know I already planned to report what I witnessed to the proper authorities." "The proper authorities?" Margaret laughed, but there was uncertainty in her eyes now. Two witnesses complicated things. "You mean the police? They won't care about some alleged incident with no proof. And by the time anyone investigates, both of you will be long gone, fired for insubordination." "Perhaps," Thomas acknowledged. "But there's also Child Protective Services, the media, and Mr. Ashford himself. I wonder what he would think about his fiancée threatening his children." Grace watched this stranger defend her, and felt something shift in the room's power dynamic. Margaret was still dangerous, still held all the official power, but she was no longer operating without any checks on her behavior. "How dare you?" Margaret hissed. "Both of you will regret this. I'll destroy you. I'll make sure you can't get jobs cleaning toilets." "That may be true," Grace said quietly, "but it won't change what you did, and it won't erase the fact that we both saw it." Emma tugged on Grace's sleeve. "I'm scared," she whispered. Grace immediately crouched down, putting herself at the children's eye level. "It's okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." "Don't comfort them," Margaret snapped. "They need to learn there are consequences for breaking expensive things. That's how children learn discipline." "By being hit?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet but firm. "That's not discipline. That's abuse." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Margaret's face flushed with rage, but before she could respond, one of the household staff, Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, appeared from the hallway. She was an older woman who had worked for the Ashford family for decades. "Miss Sinclair," Mrs. Chen said carefully, her eyes taking in the scene. "Mr. Ashford is on the phone. He's asking to speak with you." Margaret's expression flickered. Just for a moment, Grace saw something that might have been fear. Tell him I'll call him back. He said it's urgent. Something about the children. Grace felt her stomach drop. Had someone already called Marcus? Had he somehow learned about this confrontation? Margaret shot venomous looks at both Grace and Thomas before stalking toward the study where the phone waited. Her heels clicked against the marble like gunshots. As soon as she was gone, Mrs. Chen turned to Grace with an expression of concern mixed with something that might have been admiration. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen," she said quietly. "Probably both." "I couldn't let her hurt them," Grace replied simply. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Many of us have wanted to stand up to her, but we have families to feed, bills to pay. Fear is a powerful motivator." "I understand," Grace said, and she did. She'd made the same calculations herself for years. Keep quiet, keep invisible, keep safe. But there were lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Thomas approached the children gently. "Are you two all right? Did she hurt you?" Daniel shook his head, but Emma held out her arm. There were red marks where Margaret had gripped her. Not quite bruises yet, but heading in that direction. Grace felt fury rising in her chest. She carefully took Emma's arm, examining it. "Does it hurt, sweetheart?" "A little," Emma admitted, "but I'm more scared about what she'll do now. She gets really angry when people don't do what she wants." "She's been worse lately," Daniel added quietly. "Since Daddy's been gone longer than usual. She doesn't pretend to be nice anymore." Mrs. Chen's expression grew troubled. "Children, why don't you go to the kitchen? Cook made fresh cookies this morning." The children looked at Grace uncertainly. She smiled at them, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Go ahead. I'll check on you soon." After the children left, Mrs. Chen turned to Grace and Thomas, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "You both need to understand what you've gotten yourselves into. Margaret Sinclair comes from one of the oldest, wealthiest families in the country. Her father sits on the boards of half the major corporations in the city. She has connections everywhere. Police, politicians, judges. Are you saying we should have let her hit a child?" Grace asked. "I'm saying you need to be prepared for what's coming," Mrs. Chen replied. "Margaret doesn't lose. She doesn't accept defiance. She will destroy you both if she can, and she has the resources to do it." Thomas leaned against the wall, his weathered face thoughtful. "What about Mr. Ashford? Surely he wouldn't condone his fiancée abusing his children." Mrs. Chen sighed deeply. "Mr. Ashford is complicated. He's brilliant in business but blind in his personal life. He works constantly, travels everywhere. He doesn't see what happens in his own home. And Margaret is very good at presenting one face to him while showing another to everyone else. Someone has to tell him the truth," Grace insisted. "Many have tried. Staff members have raised concerns before. Margaret manages to discredit them, make them seem like disgruntled employees making up stories. Then they disappear, fired, intimidated, or bought off." Mrs. Chen looked at Grace with genuine concern. "You're different from the others. You didn't complain behind her back. You confronted her directly. She'll see you as a real threat." Before Grace could respond, they heard Margaret's heels clicking in the hallway, approaching fast. Mrs. Chen quickly busied herself with the broken vase, and Thomas moved toward the garden door, as if he'd just finished delivering a message. Margaret reappeared, her face composed, but her eyes blazing with barely suppressed fury. She looked directly at Grace. "Mr. Ashford wants to see you." Grace's heart skipped. "Mr. Ashford. He's returning to the estate. He'll be here within hours." Margaret's smile was cold and triumphant. "He wants to speak with you personally about your behavior." "I've told him everything. How you attacked me, threatened me, used the children as shields for your own agenda. We'll see how brave you are when you're explaining yourself to a man who could buy and sell your entire life with pocket change." Grace felt fear clawing at her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I'll tell him exactly what happened. The truth. Your truth against mine," Margaret purred. "Good luck with that." She swept past, leaving Grace standing in the foyer with the broken vase at her feet and the weight of consequences settling on her shoulders. Thomas approached after Margaret disappeared upstairs. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I've never met Mr. Ashford properly. I've worked here for years, but I'm just part of the invisible staff." "Why would he believe me over her?" "Because sometimes the truth has a power of its own," Thomas said quietly. And because men who build empires usually got there by reading people accurately, he might surprise you. Or he might fire me on the spot and have me arrested for assault. Possible, Thomas acknowledged. But you did the right thing. Sometimes that has to be enough. Grace looked at this strange gardener who had appeared out of nowhere and put himself at risk to support her. Why did you speak up? You could have stayed silent, kept your job, avoided all of this. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Let's just say I know what it's like to see injustice and do nothing. I lived with that regret for years. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake again. There was a story there, Grace sensed. Pain and history hidden behind weathered features and calloused hands. But before she could ask, Mrs. Chen returned. Grace, you should rest before Mr. Ashford arrives. You look exhausted. Grace realized she was indeed exhausted. Physically from the morning's impossible cleaning demands, emotionally from the confrontation, mentally from trying to prepare for what came next. But she shook her head. I need to check on Emma and Daniel. Make sure they're really okay. She found the children in the kitchen with Cook, a warm woman named Sarah, who had been with the family almost as long as Mrs. Chen. The children were eating cookies, but without much enthusiasm, their small faces worried. Grace! Emma jumped up and hugged her tightly. Are you in trouble? I might be, Grace admitted, seeing no point in lying to them. But whatever happens, I want you to know I'd do it again. You're worth protecting. Margaret says we're not worth anything, Daniel said quietly. She says Daddy only keeps us around because he has to. Grace felt her heart break a little. She sat down at the kitchen table and both children climbed into her lap. Something that would have been unthinkable with Margaret in the house. This breaking of the invisible barriers between staff and family. Listen to me, Grace said firmly. Margaret is wrong. Your father loves you very much. Sometimes adults get so caught up in their work, in their own problems, that they forget to show love in ways children can understand. But that doesn't mean the love isn't there. How do you know? Emma asked. Because I've seen how this house is arranged. Your father had your rooms decorated with everything you love. There are photos of you everywhere in his private study. He calls every night to say goodnight, even when he's halfway around the world. Those aren't the actions of a man who doesn't care. It was true. Grace had noticed these details during her years of cleaning. Marcus Ashford might be an absent father, but the evidence of love was everywhere for those who looked. Then why does he let Margaret be mean to us? Daniel asked. That was the harder question. Grace chose her words carefully. Sometimes people we love do things that hurt us, not because they want to, but because they don't know. Your father doesn't know how Margaret treats you when he's gone, but now he's going to find out. Because you told him? Emma asked hopefully. Because things happen today that he can't ignore anymore, Grace replied. And sometimes when adults are forced to see the truth, they finally take action. Sarah placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. You should eat something too. You'll need your strength. Grace accepted a cookie and some tea, trying to calm her nerves. Through the kitchen window, she could see Thomas working in the garden, his movements methodical and peaceful. There was something about him that didn't fit, some quality that suggested he was more than he appeared to be. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Grace tried to work, to maintain normalcy, but her hands shook when she picked up cleaning supplies. Mrs. Chen finally insisted she rest in the staff quarters, but Grace couldn't sit still. She paced, rehearsing what she would say to Marcus Ashford, trying to find words that would make him understand without sounding like a disgruntled employee with an agenda. Late in the afternoon, the sound of vehicles approaching brought everyone to attention. Grace watched from an upstairs window as 3 black cars pulled up to the main entrance. Security guards emerged first, then a tall man in an expensive suit. Marcus Ashford had returned. From her vantage point, Grace could see he looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from too much travel, too much responsibility, too much time away from home. He moved with the efficiency of someone who wasted no motion, who calculated every action for maximum impact. Margaret met him at the door, and Grace watched them embrace. From this distance, they looked like the perfect couple, wealth meeting beauty, power recognizing power. Margaret was already talking animatedly, no doubt presenting her version of events. Mrs. Chen appeared beside Grace. He wants to see you in the library. Immediately. Grace's mouth went dry. Both of them. Mr. Ashford wants to speak with you privately first. Margaret is not pleased about that. Grace descended the stairs with legs that felt like water. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation that would determine not just her job, but possibly her entire future. Margaret had connections everywhere. If she wanted to destroy Grace's reputation, make it impossible to get work anywhere, she had the resources to do it. The library door stood open. Grace paused at the threshold, gathering her courage, then stepped inside. Marcus Ashford stood by the window, looking out at the gardens. He didn't turn immediately, and Grace had time to study him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of face that suggested intelligence and intensity. His suit probably cost more than Grace earned in a year, and his watch caught the afternoon light with a gleam that spoke of wealth beyond imagining. "Grace Bennett," he said, still facing the window. His voice was deep, measured, devoid of obvious emotion. "You've worked in my house for several years, yet we've never properly met. Why is that?" The question surprised her. "I'm part of the household staff, sir. We're supposed to be invisible." "Invisible?" He finally turned to face her, and Grace was struck by his eyes, sharp, analytical, but with something else underneath. Exhaustion, perhaps, or loneliness. What an interesting word. "My fiancée tells me you assaulted her today, that you used my children as shields while you threatened her, that you've been spreading lies about her treatment of the staff." Grace felt panic rising, but forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. "That's not what happened, sir." "Then tell me what did happen. The truth. All of it." Grace met his eyes directly, refusing to look away. If she was going down, she would go down telling the truth. "Your fiancée was about to hit Emma for accidentally breaking a vase. I put myself between them. I told her she wouldn't hurt the children. That's when she threatened to have me fired and destroyed." Marcus's expression didn't change. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth," Grace replied. "And I have a witness. Thomas, the gardener. He saw everything. Margaret claims you're lying, that you've been insubordinate for weeks, that you've turned the staff against her, that this is all part of some scheme." Marcus moved closer, and Grace forced herself not to step back. "Why should I believe you over her?" Grace took a breath. This was the moment. Everything depended on what she said next. "Because your children have bruises on their arms from where she grabbed them. Because they're terrified of her. Because they believe you don't love them, because they think you know how she treats them and don't care enough to stop it." For the first time, Marcus's composed expression cracked. "What? Your children believe you've chosen her over them," Grace continued, her voice shaking but determined. "They think they're disappointments to you, that they're burdens. Because that's what she tells them every day when you're not here." Marcus stared at her, and Grace couldn't read his expression anymore. Shock, anger, disbelief. "You're claiming my fiancé is abusing my children. I'm telling you what I've witnessed, what they've told me, what happened today." Grace felt tears threatening but blinked them back. "You asked for the truth. That's the truth. You can choose to believe me or not. You can fire me. You can ruin my reputation. You can call the police. But it won't change what's happening to Emma and Daniel when you're not here to see it." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "Get out." Grace felt her world collapsing. She'd told the truth, and it hadn't mattered. Margaret's power and charm had won, just like everyone said they would. She turned toward the door, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. "Not you," Marcus said quietly. "I meant Margaret. Tell her I want her out of my house. Now." Grace froze, certain she'd misheard. She turned back slowly. Marcus was still facing away, but his voice held an edge of steel. "I believe you. I don't know why yet, but I do. And if my children have bruises, if they think I don't love them, if they've been living in fear in their own home—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Send the children to me," he said, "and ask Thomas the gardener to come in. I want to hear his account." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice, and left the library with her heart pounding. She'd just triggered an earthquake in one of the wealthiest households in the country, and she had no idea what the fallout would be. Grace found the children in their playroom, both sitting quietly on the floor, building blocks forgotten beside them. They looked up as she entered, their small faces etched with worry that no child should have to carry. "Is Daddy angry?" Emma asked in a small voice. Grace knelt beside them, her heart aching at how their first concern was whether they'd done something wrong. That alone told her everything she needed to know about how Margaret had conditioned them to fear consequences rather than expect protection. "Your daddy wants to see you," Grace said gently. "But he's not angry. He wants to talk to you about some very important things." "About Margaret?" Daniel whispered the name like it might summon her. "Yes, and about how much he loves you." Grace took both their hands. "I need you to be very brave now. Your daddy is going to ask you some questions, and I need you to tell him the truth. Can you do that?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "But Margaret said if we ever told Daddy anything bad about her, she would make sure we got sent away to boarding school forever." The casual cruelty of that threat made Grace's blood boil. Margaret had isolated these children, made them afraid to speak, turned their own home into a prison of silence and fear. "That's not going to happen," Grace promised. "Your daddy loves you more than anything in the world, and he's going to make sure you're safe. But he needs to hear from you what's been happening." She walked them down to the library, their small hands gripping hers tightly. At the door, she squeezed their hands one more time. "Be brave. Tell the truth. I'll be right outside if you need me." Marcus was waiting, and when he saw his children, something in his carefully controlled expression crumbled. He knelt down to their level immediately, opening his arms. Emma and Daniel hesitated only a moment before running to him, and Grace's throat tightened at the sight of this powerful man holding his children like they were the most precious things in the world. Grace stepped back, intending to leave them privacy, but Marcus looked up. "Stay, please." She nodded, positioning herself near the door, while Marcus sat on the floor with his children. This billionaire in his expensive suit, sitting cross-legged on the library carpet like any other father trying to connect with his kids. "Emma, Daniel." Marcus's voice was gentle, but Grace could hear the tension underneath. "I need you to tell me the truth about something. Has Margaret been unkind to you?" The children exchanged those silent sibling glances again. Emma spoke first, her voice barely audible. "She says we're disappointments, that we're stupid and clumsy and embarrassing. She locked me in my room," Daniel added, tears starting to fall. "For hours, because I spilled something. I was scared, and I called for her, but she didn't come." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Show me your arms, sweetheart." Emma held out her arm, revealing the red marks that were darkening into bruises. Marcus touched them with infinite gentleness, and Grace saw his hands shaking. "Did she do this today?" Both children nodded. Daniel said, "She was going to hit Emma," but Grace stopped her. Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, they were wet. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have seen this. I should have been here." "We thought you knew," Emma said in a tiny voice. "We thought you didn't care because you were always gone and you were going to marry her and—" "Stop," Marcus interrupted gently, pulling them both close. "Listen to me very carefully. I didn't know. I should have, but I didn't. And that's my fault, not yours. Never, ever yours. You are not disappointments. You are my entire world. Do you understand?" Both children began crying in earnest, and Marcus held them while they sobbed out weeks or months of suppressed fear and pain. Grace felt her own tears falling, but kept silent, witnessing this family beginning to heal. After some time, Marcus looked up at Grace. "Thomas is in the garden. Would you ask him to come in? And Mrs. Chen as well. I need to hear everything." Grace found Thomas working near the rose garden, his movements methodical as he pruned dead growth. He looked up as she approached, and she was struck again by how his eyes didn't match his role. Too intelligent, too knowing. "Mr. Ashford wants to speak with you." Thomas set down his tools and wiped his hands on his work pants. "How are the children?" "Telling him everything," Grace replied. Finally, they walked back to the house together. Grace finally asked the question that had been bothering her since the morning. "You're not really a gardener, are you?" Thomas smiled slightly. "I'm whatever I need to be. Today I needed to be someone who saw the truth and had the courage to speak it. Same as you." Before Grace could press further, they reached the library where Mrs. Chen was already waiting. Marcus had moved to his desk, though his children sat close by in oversized chairs, unwilling to be far from him. "Thomas," Marcus gestured to a seat. "Grace tells me you witnessed this morning's incident." "I did, sir." Thomas's demeanor had shifted slightly. still respectful, but with a bearing that suggested he was used to being in rooms where important decisions were made. I saw Miss Sinclair grab the children roughly after they accidentally broke a vase. I saw her raise her hand to strike the older child. I saw Grace intervene to protect them. And you chose to speak up, knowing it could cost you your job. Some things are worth losing a job over, sir. Marcus studied Thomas with an intensity that made Grace wonder if he was seeing the same inconsistencies she had noticed. You're new here. Why did you take a position as a gardener? I like working with my hands, Thomas replied smoothly. And sometimes you see things more clearly when people think you're invisible. There was a moment of understanding that passed between the two men, some recognition that Grace couldn't quite parse. Then Marcus turned to Mrs. Chen. How long has this been going on? Mrs. Chen looked uncomfortable. The staff has been concerned for weeks, sir. Miss Sinclair has been difficult, but we were afraid to speak up. She made it clear that anyone who complained would be terminated and blacklisted. And no one thought to contact me directly? She monitors your communications, sir, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Emails, phone calls. She said she was protecting you from unnecessary distractions. Any staff member who tried to reach you found their messages intercepted. Grace watched Marcus process this, saw the moment he realized how thoroughly he'd been isolated from the reality of his own home. His hands clenched on the desk. Where is Margaret now? In the East Wing, sir, Mrs. Chen replied. Packing, though she's making quite a scene. As if summoned by mention of her name, Margaret's voice echoed down the hallway, high and furious. I don't care what he thinks he knows. I'm not leaving this house until I speak with him. The library door burst open. Margaret stood there, her polished appearance slightly disheveled, her eyes blazing with fury and something else, desperation. Marcus, this is insane. You're going to believe servants over me? Over your fiancé? Former fiancé, Marcus said coldly. And yes, I believe people who have no reason to lie over someone who apparently terrorized my children. They're lying, all of them. They've been conspiring against me since I moved in because they resent that I was going to be mistress of this house. Margaret's voice took on a pleading quality. Think about it, Marcus. Why would I hurt your children? What possible reason would I have? Control, Grace heard herself saying. Everyone turned to look at her. She'd meant to stay silent, but the words came out anyway. You hurt them to control everyone else, to show the staff what you were capable of, to make sure no one challenged you. Margaret's face twisted with rage. This is all your fault. You turned him against me. I protected children from being struck, Grace replied steadily. That's all I did. You destroyed my life. Margaret lunged toward Grace, but Thomas moved swiftly, positioning himself between them. That's enough. Marcus stood, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. Margaret, you have 1 hour to gather your belongings and leave. Security will escort you off the property. If you ever come near my children again, I'll have you arrested. You can't do this! Margaret's desperation was fully visible now. Do you know who my father is? The connections my family has? I can destroy you, Marcus. I can make your life a nightmare. Try, Marcus said simply. But you'll find that terrorizing children and threatening witnesses gives me quite a lot of leverage. I have excellent attorneys. They're already preparing documentation of everything that happened here. If you attempt any retaliation against me, my children, or any member of my staff, that documentation becomes public. Margaret stared at him, perhaps finally realizing she'd lost. Her expression cycled through rage, disbelief, and finally cold calculation. This isn't over. Yes, Marcus replied. It is. Security guards appeared at the door. They must have been waiting nearby. Margaret drew herself up, attempting to salvage some dignity as she was escorted out. But at the doorway, she turned back, her eyes finding Grace. You'll regret this, she said softly. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually you'll pay for what you've done to me. Then she was gone, her heels clicking down the hallway one final time. The silence that followed felt profound. Emma and Daniel pressed closer to their father, and Marcus wrapped his arms around them protectively. Sir, Mrs. Chen said quietly, what would you like us to do about everything? Marcus looked around at the small group gathered in his library. His housekeeper who had served his family for decades, a gardener who wasn't quite what he seemed, a maid who had risked everything to protect his children and the children themselves, watching him with a mixture of hope and lingering fear. "I want to talk to the entire staff," Marcus said. "Tonight. Everyone who works in this house. I need to understand how I let things get this bad, and I need to make sure it never happens again." He looked directly at Grace. "You saved my children today. How do I thank someone for that?" Grace felt overwhelmed by the direct attention from this powerful man. "I don't need thanks, sir. I just need to know they're safe." "They are now," Marcus promised. "Because of you." He paused. "Grace, I know your household staff, but I need someone I can trust near the children while I figure out permanent arrangements. Would you consider taking on more responsibility, helping to care for them?" Grace's breath caught. "Sir, I'm just a maid. I don't have training in—" "You have something better than training," Marcus interrupted. "You have courage and integrity. You saw something wrong and you stood up to power to protect children who couldn't protect themselves. That's exactly the kind of person I want in my children's lives." "We want Grace," Emma said immediately. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. Grace looked at these children who had already been through so much, at this father who was trying to rebuild trust he hadn't known was broken, and made her decision. "I would be honored, sir." "Marcus," he corrected gently. "If you're going to be part of helping raise my children, you should call me Marcus." Later, after the formal staff meeting where Marcus apologized for his absence and promised changes, after the children had finally been coaxed to sleep, Grace found herself in the garden. She needed air, space to process everything that had happened. Thomas was there, sitting on a stone bench, looking up at the stars. "Can't sleep?" he asked as she approached. "Too much to think about," Grace admitted, sitting beside him. "Everything changed so fast. That's how transformation often happens. Slowly, then all at once." Thomas smiled. "You did something extraordinary today. You helped. I was the witness. You were the hero." Grace shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who couldn't stand by anymore." "That's exactly what heroes are," Thomas replied. "People who reach a point where they can't tolerate injustice, even when speaking up costs them everything." Grace studied him in the moonlight. "Who are you really, Thomas? And please don't say you're just a gardener." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Let's just say I know what it's like to have power and use it badly, to hurt people without meaning to, because you were too focused on your own goals to see the damage you were causing. You're speaking from experience." "Unfortunately, yes." Thomas stood, brushing soil from his work pants. "The garden is a kind of penance, growing things instead of destroying them, nurturing instead of taking. It's helped me understand what really matters." He started to walk away, then paused. "Grace, be careful. Margaret isn't done. People like her don't accept defeat gracefully. She'll try something." "Let her try," Grace said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm not afraid anymore." Thomas smiled sadly. "Courage is good, but wisdom is better. Watch your back." After he left, Grace sat alone in the garden for a while, letting the events of the day wash over her. She'd woken up this morning as invisible household staff, someone whose name the owner of the house didn't even know. Now she was being trusted with his children's care, given responsibility she'd never imagined having. It should have felt like victory, and part of it did, but Thomas's warning echoed in her mind. People like Margaret had resources, connections, the ability to hurt people in ways that never left visible bruises. Grace looked up at the mansion, saw lights still burning in Marcus's study where he was probably working through the implications of everything he'd learned, saw the children's windows, dark now as they finally slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. She'd protected them today. But could she protect them from whatever Margaret might do next? Only time would tell. And somewhere in the city, in a hotel suite where she'd been forced to take refuge, Margaret Sinclair was making phone calls, pulling strings, preparing her revenge. The real battle was just beginning. The days following Margaret's expulsion transformed the Ashford estate in ways Grace hadn't anticipated. It was as if the entire house had been holding its breath and now finally exhaled. Staff members smiled more openly, the children's laughter echoed through hallways that had been silent, and slowly, carefully, the mansion began to feel like a home rather than a beautifully decorated prison. Grace moved into a suite adjacent to the children's rooms, no longer the tiny staff quarters she'd occupied for years, but a proper bedroom with its own bathroom and sitting area. The first morning she woke up there, she'd stood in the doorway for several minutes, unable to believe this was her reality. "Grace," Emma's voice called from down the hall. "Are you coming to breakfast?" That was another change. Grace no longer ate separately with the staff, but joined Marcus and the children for meals. It felt strange at first, sitting at that enormous dining table where she'd once served food, now being served herself. But Marcus had insisted. "You're not just staff anymore," he'd said that first morning. "You're part of this family. Act like it. Family." The word stirred complicated emotions Grace had carefully buried for years. She'd lost her own family long ago in circumstances she preferred not to examine too closely. The idea of being part of a new one felt dangerous, like opening herself to loss all over again. But watching Emma and Daniel flourish under consistent care and genuine affection, she couldn't regret her decision. Marcus himself was different. He'd cancelled several business trips, working from his home office instead, making sure he was present for breakfast and dinner, for homework, and bedtime stories. Grace watched him relearn how to be a father, saw the guilt he carried for not seeing what was happening under his own roof. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," he told Grace one evening after the children were asleep. They'd fallen into a habit of talking in the library, discussing the children's progress, their needs, their healing. "You trusted someone you loved," Grace replied. "That's not a character flaw. But I trusted her more than I trusted my own instincts about my children." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd seen many times now. "Emma tried to tell me she was sad. I thought it was just adjustment to having Margaret around." Daniel became quiet, withdrawn. "I told myself he was just getting older." "You know now," Grace said gently. "And you're here now. That's what matters." Marcus looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How did you see it? What made you willing to risk everything when so many others chose silence?" Grace was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to reveal. "I know what it's like to be a child who needs protection and doesn't get it. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the power to help a child, I would, no matter the cost. Your childhood was difficult. It wasn't a question." Marcus had probably done background checks on all his staff, especially now, especially her. Grace wondered what he'd found, what gaps in her history had raised questions. "Difficult is one word for it," Grace acknowledged. "But it taught me to recognize when a child is suffering. Emma and Daniel have that same look I used to see in my own mirror." "Used to?" Grace smiled slightly. "It fades. With time, safety, and people who genuinely care. Your children will be okay, Marcus. They have you now. Really have you." "They have us," Marcus corrected. "You're part of this too." The words created warmth in Grace's chest and fear in equal measure. She'd learned long ago not to get attached, not to build connections that could be severed. But these people were making it impossible to maintain her careful emotional distance. The peaceful restoration was shattered one morning when Grace found Marcus in his study, staring at his computer screen with an expression of cold fury. "What's wrong?" she asked from the doorway. Marcus gestured at the screen. "Margaret's revenge. It's starting." Grace came closer and felt her stomach drop as she read the headline. "Billionaire's Maid seduces employer, destroys engagement. Inside source reveals calculated scheme." The article was devastating. It painted Grace as a manipulative woman who had deliberately targeted Marcus, fabricated stories about Margaret, turned the children against their father's fiancée, all as part of a calculated plan to secure her own position in the household and potentially marry into wealth herself. "There are photos," Marcus said grimly, clicking through, "of us having dinner with the children, of me talking with you in the garden, of you in your new suite. Someone's been watching, documenting, building a narrative." The photos were real, but the context was completely twisted. A conversation about the children's schoolwork looked like an intimate moment. Marcus handing her a cup of coffee appeared romantic. Her new bedroom was presented as evidence of her elevated status in the household. "It's all lies," Grace whispered, feeling her careful world crumbling. "Marcus, you have to believe—" "I know it's lies," Marcus interrupted firmly. "But Margaret has connections to half the media outlets in the city. This story is everywhere. Entertainment news, social media, gossip columns. She's trying to destroy your reputation and make me look like a fool who was manipulated." Grace sank into a chair, her mind racing. "She's really doing this?" She's actually going to ruin me. Not if I have anything to say about it. Marcus was already typing, making calls, activating his own network of contacts and attorneys. I'll issue statements, threaten lawsuits, whatever it takes. That might make it worse, Grace said quietly. The more you defend me, the more it looks like I really did seduce you. The more attention you give the story, the bigger it becomes. So what? I just let her destroy you? You protect your children, Grace replied, forcing herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. That's what matters. Your reputation, their stability. If I need to leave. No. Marcus's voice was absolute. You're not leaving. Emma and Daniel need you. I need... He stopped himself. This household needs you. Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared at the door, her face grave. Sir, there are reporters at the gate. Quite a few of them. And social services just called. They received an anonymous complaint about the children's welfare, and will be sending someone to investigate. Grace felt everything collapsing. Of course, Margaret would weaponize Child Protective Services. It was brilliant and vicious. Either the investigation would find nothing and still cast doubt, or Margaret had somehow planted evidence to make Grace look dangerous. When are they coming? Marcus asked, his voice deadly calm. This afternoon. Yes. Marcus nodded once, his expression shifting into what Grace recognized as his business mode. Analytical, strategic, ruthless when necessary. Call my legal team. I want them here before the social worker arrives, and get building security to photograph every reporter at our gate. If any of them trespass, I want them arrested. After Mrs. Chen left, Marcus turned to Grace. Tell me everything about your past. Everything that might come up in an investigation. I need to know what we're dealing with. Grace's throat tightened. This was the moment she'd been dreading since all of this started. Marcus, there are things in my history that look bad, out of context. Tell me. She took a breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes. I've moved around a lot. Different cities, different jobs, always leaving after a year or two. It looks like I'm running from something. Are you? In a way. Grace struggled to find words for truth she'd never spoken aloud. I grew up in foster care. 13 different homes between ages 5 and 18. Some were okay, some were not okay. I learned to disappear, to not make connections, to leave before things got too complicated or painful. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I aged out of the system, I had nothing. No family, no support, no money. I took whatever work I could find. Cleaning, serving, caregiving. And I kept moving because staying anywhere too long meant people would start asking questions, wanting to know about my family, my past, my life. It was easier to just be invisible. Until you couldn't be anymore, Marcus said quietly. Until 2 children needed someone to stand up for them, Grace corrected. And I couldn't walk away from that. Is there anything else? Anything Margaret could use against you? Grace hesitated. There was an incident at a previous job. A family accused me of stealing jewelry. It wasn't true. Their teenage daughter had actually taken it and pawned it. But by the time that came out, I'd already been fired and the accusation was on my record. Did you press charges? Get your name cleared officially? No. I just moved on. It seemed easier than fighting. Grace heard how weak that sounded. I didn't have money for lawyers. I didn't know how to fight back against people with resources and power. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. So Margaret could dredge up this accusation, make it look like a pattern of behavior. Yes. Grace felt tears threatening but blinked them back. Marcus, I understand if you need me to leave. If my presence here puts your children at risk. Stop, Marcus interrupted. You saved my children. You stood up to someone powerful and dangerous when everyone else, including me, was blind. I'm not abandoning you now just because she's good at manipulating narratives. But the investigation will find nothing wrong because there is nothing wrong. You've been exemplary with Emma and Daniel. The house is safe. The children are thriving. Everything is documented. Marcus's expression hardened. Margaret is counting on me being weak, being swayed by public opinion or afraid of scandal. She doesn't know me very well if she thinks that. A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas stood there, still in his gardening clothes, but with that same quality Grace had noticed before, something that didn't quite fit his role. Apologies for interrupting, Thomas said. But I thought you should know there's someone trying to bribe the staff. offering money for negative stories about Grace and the children's care. Marcus's jaw clenched. Who? Private investigator, working for Margaret's attorney. He approached 3 staff members that I know of. They all refused and reported it to Mrs. Chen. Good. Marcus pulled out his phone. That gives us something to work with. Witness intimidation, attempting to manufacture evidence. My attorneys will have a field day with this. Thomas nodded, then looked at Grace. There's something else. The reporter who wrote that article. I did some checking. He's known for creating hit pieces, and he has financial connections to Margaret's family business. The story wasn't journalism. It was a paid attack. How did you find that out? Marcus asked, his tone sharp with interest. Thomas smiled slightly. I have some experience researching financial connections. Let's leave it at that. After Thomas left, Grace stared at the door. He's not a gardener. No, Marcus agreed. He's not. But whoever he is, he's on our side. And right now, I'll take all the allies we can get. The social services investigation that afternoon was thorough, but ultimately found nothing concerning. The investigator, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Ford, spent hours talking to the children separately, inspecting their rooms, reviewing household documentation, interviewing staff. Grace sat through her own interview with her stomach in knots, answering questions about her background, her relationship with the children, her duties in the household. Patricia took notes without revealing what she thought, her professional demeanor giving nothing away. Finally, Patricia closed her folder and looked directly at Grace. Off the record, the complaint was anonymous, but the details were extremely specific. Someone who knows this household tried to make it look like you're either negligent or inappropriate with the children. Margaret Sinclair, Marcus said from where he'd been waiting with his attorneys. Patricia held up a hand. I didn't say that, but I will say this. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I know when children are genuinely cared for, and when they're being used as weapons in adult conflicts. Emma and Daniel are happy, healthy, well-adjusted kids who clearly adore Grace. Whatever game is being played here, the children aren't suffering. They're thriving. Grace felt tears of relief threatening. So we're cleared? Officially, the investigation will remain open for 30 days, but I'm recommending no further action. Patricia stood, gathering her materials. Unofficially, you all might want to document everything. If whoever filed this complaint tries again, you'll want evidence of the pattern of harassment. After Patricia left, Grace finally let herself breathe. Emma and Daniel, who had been waiting anxiously in the playroom with Sarah, came running. Are you leaving? Emma asked fearfully. No, sweetheart. Grace pulled both children close. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Daniel pressed his face against her side. I promise. But even as she said the words, Grace knew the battle wasn't over. Margaret had lost this round, but she had resources, connections, and apparently unlimited willingness to hurt people. That night, unable to sleep, Grace walked through the darkened house. She found herself in the library, drawn by the light still burning there. Marcus was at his desk, surrounded by documents and legal papers. Couldn't sleep either, he asked without looking up. Too much adrenaline. Grace sat in one of the leather chairs. Thank you. For today. For believing me. For fighting for me. Marcus finally looked up, and Grace was struck by the exhaustion in his face. You shouldn't have to thank me for doing what's right. Most people don't, though. Do what's right when it's inconvenient or complicated or publicly messy. Most people didn't risk everything to save my children. Marcus set down his pen. Grace, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Her stomach tightened. Okay. Why did you really confront Margaret that day? The real reason, not the noble one. What made you risk your entire life for children who weren't yours? Grace was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth to reveal. Finally, she spoke words she'd never said aloud before. When I was 7 years old, I was in a foster home where the father was cruel. Not physically abusive in ways that left marks, but emotionally vicious. He would tell us we were worthless, that no one wanted us, that we were garbage the world threw away. Marcus's expression shifted, pain and understanding dawning. One day he was screaming at a younger girl. She was maybe 5, and I saw him raise his hand to hit her. And I couldn't. I stepped between them. I told him he couldn't hurt her. Grace's voice shook with the memory. He hit me instead, broke my arm. But the little girl was okay. Grace. They removed us from that home after that. The little girl got adopted by a good family. I saw her years later. She was happy, thriving, safe. And I realized that sometimes getting hurt is worth it if it means a child gets protected. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotion. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice rough. Emma and Daniel aren't the only ones you saved that day. You saved me too. From becoming someone who was blind to suffering in his own home. From being so focused on business and success that I lost sight of what actually matters. Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They sat together in the quiet library, two people who had been fundamentally changed by a moment of moral courage, trying to figure out what came next. Outside, in the garden, Thomas stood in the shadows, watching the house. His phone buzzed with a message. "Package delivered. Are you sure about this?" Thomas typed back a single word. Yes. Because there were things Grace didn't know yet. Things Marcus didn't know. Things that would change everything again. And they were about to be revealed. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by private courier directly to Marcus's study. Grace was with the children in the garden, watching them play while Thomas worked nearby, when Mrs. Chen came hurrying out with an expression of controlled alarm. "Grace, Mr. Ashford needs you immediately. It's urgent." The tone made Grace's stomach clench. She'd learned to read the subtle warnings in Mrs. Chen's voice, and this was serious. She called Sarah to watch the children and hurried inside, her mind racing through possibilities. Another media attack, more false accusations, legal problems. What she found in the study was worse. Marcus stood by his desk, his face pale, holding what looked like photographs. His hands were shaking, something Grace had never seen before. This man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals looked genuinely shaken. "Marcus? What's wrong?" He looked up, and Grace saw fury and fear warring in his expression. Without a word, he handed her the photographs. Grace's blood turned to ice as she looked through them. They were surveillance photos, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. Emma and Daniel at school, Emma walking to her classroom, Daniel on the playground. Both children getting into the car with their driver. Each photo had a red circle drawn around the children's faces, and there was a note printed on plain paper. Such beautiful children. It would be a shame if something happened to them. Drop the legal action against me, or find out how far I'm willing to go. She's threatening my children, Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. Margaret is threatening to harm my children. Grace felt rage and terror in equal measure. Have you called the police? They're on their way. So is my head of security and a team of bodyguards. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of barely controlled panic. But Grace, she's watching them. Someone she hired has been following my children, photographing them, tracking their routines. For how long? What else does she know? The school? Their activities? Their schedule? Grace's mind was racing, thinking like someone who had to stay one step ahead of danger her entire life. She knows when they're vulnerable. I'm pulling them out of school immediately. They'll have private tutors here on the estate with security. Marcus was already making decisions, falling back into the control that was his default mode. I'm increasing estate security, installing more cameras, hiring. Marcus, Grace interrupted gently. They can't live in a prison. That's letting her win. I don't care about winning. Marcus's control cracked, his voice rising. I care about keeping them alive. She's clearly unstable, clearly willing to hurt children to get revenge. I won't risk them. Grace understood the fear. She felt it too, a cold knot in her stomach that had been there since the moment she'd seen those photographs. But she also knew something about living with fear. If you lock them away, if you let terror control your decisions, you're teaching them that's how you handle threats. You're giving Margaret exactly what she wants, to disrupt their lives, to make them afraid, to prove she still has power over this family. Marcus stared at her, his jaw tight. So what do you suggest? We just pretend everything's fine while someone is stalking my children? No. We protect them intelligently. Security, but invisible. We vary their routines. We stay vigilant. We make sure they're never vulnerable. But we don't lock them in a cage and call it safety. Before Marcus could respond, there was a commotion from the hallway. Voices raised in argument, someone demanding entry. Thomas appeared at the study door. and for the first time since Grace had known him, he looked genuinely concerned. "Sir, there's someone here claiming to be Margaret's attorney. He's insisting on speaking with you immediately, saying he has a settlement offer that expires in 10 minutes. "Let him in," Marcus said grimly. "I want witnesses for whatever threat he's about to make." The man who entered was everything Grace had learned to recognize as dangerous. Expensive suit, practiced smile, eyes like a shark evaluating prey. He introduced himself as Robert Caldwell, senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. "Mr. Ashford, Grace Bennett." Caldwell nodded to each of them. "I'll be brief. My client, Miss Sinclair, is willing to cease all legal action, all media campaigns, and all further contact with this household under the following conditions." He placed a document on the desk. "You drop all charges and legal complaints against her. You issue a public statement saying the breakup was mutual and amicable. You pay her $10 million as compensation for emotional distress and reputational damage. And most importantly, Grace Bennett is terminated immediately and signs a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement." The silence that followed was absolute. Grace felt as if she'd been punched. After everything, Margaret still wanted her destroyed. "That's extortion," Marcus said coldly. "That's a settlement offer," Caldwell replied smoothly. "One that expires in precisely—" He checked his watch. 8 minutes. After which, my client will pursue every legal and extra-legal avenue available to her. And Mr. Ashford, you should know that Miss Sinclair's family has very extensive resources and very few moral limitations when protecting their interests." "Is that a threat?" Thomas spoke from his position by the door, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. Caldwell glanced at him dismissively. "I don't make threats to gardeners. Now, Mr. Ashford, your decision?" Marcus looked at Grace, and she saw the calculation in his eyes, weighing the cost of fighting against the safety of his children. She knew what he was thinking. $10 million was nothing to him. Firing Grace would be easy. Making a public statement would be mildly embarrassing but survivable. It was the smart play, the safe play, the play that protected his children from a woman who was clearly willing to hurt them. Grace made the decision for him. "I'll take the deal," she said quietly. "I'll leave. Sign whatever they want. Disappear. Just leave the children alone." "Grace." "No," Marcus started. "Yes," Grace interrupted, looking directly at Caldwell. "I'll sign your non-disclosure agreement. I'll leave this house and never speak about what happened here. But Margaret has to guarantee she'll never contact these children again. Never threaten this family, never." "Grace, stop," Marcus said firmly. He turned to Caldwell. "Tell Margaret she can take her settlement offer and her threats and go straight to—" "Marcus, think about Emma and Daniel," Grace pleaded. "I am thinking about them." Marcus's voice rose. "I'm thinking about what kind of father I want to be. What kind of man I want them to see me as. Do I want them to learn that when bullies threaten us we surrender? That we sacrifice the people who protected us to buy temporary safety?" He faced Caldwell with cold fury. "Here's my counteroffer. Margaret drops everything and disappears. Or I spend $100 million making sure every crime she's committed, every person she's hurt, every law she's broken becomes public knowledge. I'll hire investigators. I'll sue her family's companies. I'll make it my personal mission to destroy everything she cares about. And unlike her, I have the resources to actually do it." Caldwell's practiced smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Ashford, you're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was ever trusting that woman near my children. Now get out of my house. You have 5 seconds before I have security remove you." After Caldwell left, threatening lawsuits and consequences, Grace turned to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "You should have taken the deal. Your children's safety is worth fighting for, not negotiating away," Marcus replied. "Grace, do you think I don't understand what you were trying to do? You were willing to sacrifice yourself to protect Emma and Daniel, just like you did when you stepped between them and Margaret, because they matter more than I do." "No," Marcus said firmly, stepping closer. "They matter just as much as you do, and I'm not in the business of sacrificing good people to appease bad ones." Thomas cleared his throat from the doorway. "If I may interrupt this moment of nobility, we have a more immediate problem. The security team I called discovered something during their sweep of the estate." "What?" Marcus's attention snapped to him. "Surveillance devices. Cameras and microphones. Professionally installed, hidden in multiple rooms. Someone's been watching and listening to this house for weeks. Grace felt her blood run cold. Margaret knows everything we've said, everything we've planned. Every weakness, every fear, every strategy, Thomas finished. She's been 3 steps ahead this entire time because she had eyes and ears inside the house. Marcus looked like he might put his fist through a wall. How? When? My security is supposed to be impenetrable. Someone on the inside, Thomas said quietly. Someone helped install those devices. Someone in your household is working for Margaret. The implications hit Grace like a physical blow. They'd been betrayed. Someone they trusted, someone who had access to the children, someone who had seemed loyal, had been reporting everything to their enemy. I want every staff member interviewed, Marcus said immediately. I want lie detector tests, background checks, everything. That will take time we don't have, Thomas interrupted, and it will tip off whoever the mole is that we know. Better to feed false information, see who takes the bait. Marcus studied Thomas with new intensity. You seem to know a lot about counter-surveillance and intelligence operations for a gardener. Thomas smiled slightly. I've had an interesting life. Before Marcus could press further, Emma's scream pierced through the house from outside. All 3 of them bolted toward the sound, Grace's heart in her throat. They found Emma and Daniel in the garden, both pale and shaking. Sarah was holding them, her expression frightened. At their feet was a dead bird, its neck broken, and a note pinned to its body with a knife. Marcus picked up the note with shaking hands. It read, "This could have been one of your children. Last warning. Accept the deal, or pay the price." Emma was crying hysterically, and Daniel had gone completely silent. That terrible silence of a traumatized child shutting down. Grace immediately went to them, pulling both into her arms. But her mind was racing. Someone had gotten onto the estate, past security, past cameras, close enough to the children to leave this gruesome message, and they'd done it in broad daylight while the house was full of people. That's it, Marcus said, his voice deadly calm in the way that meant he was absolutely furious. I'm calling in every favor I have. Federal investigators, private military contractors, the best security money can buy. Margaret wants war? She's got it. But Grace was looking at Thomas, who was examining the knife and the dead bird with the professional interest of someone who had seen violence before. When he caught her watching, he gave an almost imperceptible nod. He understood something she didn't, saw something the rest of them had missed. Later, after the children had finally been calmed and put to bed early, after new security protocols had been implemented and the estate locked down like a fortress, Grace found Thomas in the garden. He was standing where the bird had been found, studying the ground. What did you see? Grace asked quietly. Thomas looked up, then gestured to the ground. The bird wasn't killed here. It was killed somewhere else and placed here. Professional work. The kind of intimidation tactic used by people who understand psychological warfare. You're not a gardener, Grace said. It wasn't a question anymore. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he straightened, and something in his bearing changed. The slight hunch of a laborer disappearing, replaced by the posture of someone accustomed to command. My name is Thomas Ashford, he said quietly. Marcus's older brother. Grace felt the world tilt. What? Marcus doesn't know I'm here. We've been estranged for years. I made mistakes, hurt people, including my family. I was working abroad when I heard about his engagement to Margaret. Something about it didn't sit right, so I came back quietly to check on things. You've been spying on your own brother? I've been protecting his children when he couldn't see the danger, Thomas corrected. When I saw Margaret's true nature, I stayed close. I was there that day because I knew she was escalating, knew she would eventually hurt those kids, and I needed to be ready to intervene. Grace processed this revelation, her mind reeling. Does Marcus know now? No, and I was planning to keep it that way until this was over. Thomas looked toward the house. But things have gotten too dangerous. Margaret has resources I didn't anticipate, connections that go deeper than I realized. She's not just a spoiled socialite seeking revenge. She's something worse. What do you mean? Thomas pulled out his phone, showing Grace a series of files and photographs. Margaret's family isn't just wealthy. They have connections to organized crime, to political corruption, to people who make problems disappear. I've been investigating while I was here. And Grace, she's not the mastermind. She's working for someone else. Who? Her father, Victor Sinclair, and he's decided that Marcus embarrassing his daughter is a personal insult that requires retaliation. We're not just dealing with a vengeful ex-fiancé anymore. We're dealing with a criminal organization that sees this family as a threat to their reputation. Grace felt fear like she'd never experienced before. The children are in more danger than Marcus realizes, Thomas finished, which is why I need to tell him the truth. All of it, including who I really am. They found Marcus still in his study, surrounded by security personnel and phone records and surveillance equipment. When he saw Thomas approach with Grace, his expression shifted to confusion. "What's going on?" Thomas took a breath. "Marcus, there's something you need to know. About me, about Margaret, about why you're really in danger." And he began to speak, revealing truths that would change everything one final time. Outside, in a car parked just beyond the estate's perimeter, Victor Sinclair watched the house through binoculars. His daughter Margaret sat beside him, her face cold and calculating. "They think they've won," she said softly. "They have no idea what's coming." "Patience," Victor replied. "We move tomorrow night, and when we do, Marcus Ashford will learn what it costs to humiliate my family." Inside the house, none of them knew they had less than 24 hours before everything would explode. The final battle was about to begin.